5 more minutes. I had a student up in Alaska, and he was out on Cook Inlet, down where the Kenai River empties into the inlet over there. And if you look right straight across, there's a big cannery over there, and there are these fishing nets that are out here in the inlet. And those guys spend a lot of money buying licenses and manufacturing those fishing nets out there to catch salmon. Well, this guy is up here at the mouth of the Kenai River, and he's and he's gilling and gaffing salmon. He's just as fast as he can throw them up here on the ground. And the report was that when they captured him, he had 237 salmon. He's just throwing them up here. And the game warden came along and said, "Where's your license?" And he said, "Oh, I don't have a license." Throwing it over here. "Well, you can't catch fish without a license." He said, "Why not?" "It's against the law." And they took all of his fish and arrested him, threw him in jail. Jesus, now we got to litigate. So I went in front of the judge, and the judge said, "Well, do you have a license?" "Well, no." "Well, what were you going to do with 237 fish?" "Well, I'm a subsistence fisherman. I was going to take them home, feed my family with them." "You going to take them home, feed your family? Why don't you work?" He said, "I don't have a social security number. I can't get a job, and I can't get welfare." Oh. So they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled just exactly the way Blackstone told us they ought to. You see, everybody's involved in commercial fishing. And the reason that it's commercial and you need a license is because it's sport fishing. Aren't you all sportsmen? See, a sportsman, he goes out and catches a fish and mounts it on the wall. But the law doesn't provide for you to be a sport or a commercial fisherman. It provides that you can be a subsistence fisherman. That's what Indians are. They're all subsistence fishermen. They catch the fish to eat. Now, the normal person would catch a fish, take it to the cannery and sell it, then take the money and go to Safeway and convert the money into food and take it home and feed his family. Now, isn't that the normal way to do that? And that's why you need a license, because that's commercial. But when you're catching the fish and you're going to take them home and feed your family, that's called subsistence fishing or subsistence farming or subsistence living. And you've got a natural, common law, inalienable right to do that. Now let me show you what happens when you got a social security number. I had another student do this one. He had 5 deer in his locker. This is up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Well, somebody ratted on him, and the game warden came over and seized the 5 deer, arrested the guy, put him in jail, charged him with having deer out of season, no license, and hauled him up in front of the judge. And the judge says, "How come you got 5 deer in your locker?" And he said, "Because I needed to feed them to my family." And the judge says, "No, you didn't. You could go down and get a job, or you could go down and get welfare." And he took the 5 deer and he gave them to some needy family. Who's needy? Well, somebody that's on welfare. That's a needy family. This man has no right to reduce a wild animal to his possession and eat it when he's got a social security number. Because the state has the fiduciary responsibility of feeding, clothing, and housing you. Same thing is true with land. If you didn't have a social security number or a birth certificate, you could go out and claim land under the law of Moses today in the public land. Can't go out and claim my land, but out in the public land. The reason that you can't, and the reason that the land, not the land patent, but the Homestead Act was repealed in 1964 is because by 1964 everybody had been brought into the system. Everybody has a right to food stamps, welfare, public education, public housing. There's no need for you to go out and take a piece of land for subsistence living. And so they simply closed the door. But that doesn't mean that you don't have the right to do that if the conditions were correct. Well, let me give you a quick illustration from my land school. Let's suppose you wanted to claim a piece of land. Have you got a social security number, man? You can't claim public land. Anybody in here with no social security number? Here's a fellow. Do you have a birth certificate? No birth certificate. Okay, so you can't work, can you? So let's just take an easy one. Let's go to Alaska, and let's go into the Department of Labor, and let's ask for a job. Can you get a job without a social security number? If you think you can, go test it. Just walk into job service, tell them I'm looking for a job, fill out the application where it says Social Security number, write, and then see what they say. We tested it, and they're very kind. They tell you, look, if you don't have a Social Security number, just go down and get one. And when you come back with your Social Security number, we'll give you a job. You do the same thing with welfare. You go down to welfare and you tell them, geez, I'm hungry, I don't have a job. They tell me down at job service I can't get employment. Will you give me food stamps? And they'll give you a form to fill out. Fill out the form, and when you don't put a Social Security number in, they'll be very kind to you. They'll say, ma'am, if you'll just go down and get a Social Security number and come back, fill in the Social Security number, we'll give you food stamps. Now, if you were a common law free man and you said, well, gee, I can't do that, it's against the law of Moses, I'm going to practice the common law. Now let's go down and claim an island. So now we go into the panhandle of Alaska, and let's take a piece of real estate that's reasonable, because the common law provides that you can have all the land that you can use, occupy, and possess. Use means you've got to put it to use. Occupy means you've got to live on it. And possess means you have to be able to defend it. So let's cut down some trees, build us a cabin, and then take the clearing and let's plant some seeds and get our garden growing and wait for Ranger Rick. One of these days, Ranger Rick will come along and he will charge you with criminal trespass on the Tongass National Forest. Well, this is the stuff of which constitutional confrontations are made. Now they're going to take you to Anchorage and you'll go in before the federal district judge and he's going to say, why are you trespassing on the Tongass National Forest? And then you come back and you say, I'm not trespassing, I claimed it. I've claimed all the land I can use, occupy, and possess, and nothing more. I have about 600 acres. I've put a fence around the whole 600 acres. It's in the form of signs posted at the water's edge. I claimed the whole island. And I'm using that island for my subsistence. I'm a subsistence farmer. See how simple that is? Now, if you don't have the Social Security number and you've claimed the land under the Land Claim Act or the Landmark Statute of the Law of Moses, now you're protected by the First Amendment's Free Exercise Clause as construed by Seeger versus U.S. at 163, no, it's 384 U.S. 163, in which now you're a subsistence farmer who has a need for the land because you can't get a job. And you've always had a right to life, haven't you? I mean, do I have to cease to exist? No. Life, liberty, and property. So I've got a right to my freedom, and I've got a right to the property. I don't have a right to 10 million acres. I don't have a right to the whole state of Alaska. But I've got a right to a piece of ground that I can use, occupy, and possess. Now that's been tested twice. One of my students, Dallas Qualman, tested it when he claimed 10,000 acres in the Birds of Prey National Wilderness Area. This is some years ago. That was a little bit more land than he could use, occupy, and possess. But when push came to shove, Hal Ryan and the U.S. government, the Bureau of Land Management, decided that they would cede 160 acres to him. Now that Birds of Prey National Wilderness Area was one of Cecil Andrus's brainchilds back in the 70s. Dallas, who is a 25% Indian from Texas, had a little bit of an in that when he made the land claim. He was an Indian and did so in the Bruno-Shoshone Indian land claim, which was never ceded to the United States government. When we tested this issue in 1980, and Neelis Cook claimed 54,000 acres in the Boise National Forest, that claim failed, but let me tell you how. They came into federal court and Hal Ryan asked Neelis the question. He said, where'd you get the title? And Neelis said, I created it out of thin air and recorded it in Mountain Home. And Neelis had wrote a subpoena ducis tecum and demanded that the government bring in and show the abstract or the deed giving the United States government title over the Boise National Forest. At one time, there were 12 attorneys based in Washington, D.C. working on the Cook case because the United States government never has had title to that land. It's a fiction of law. So the way it came out was that they charged his father with criminal theft, felony, for stealing logs off of the claim. Now his daddy couldn't defend, so they came to Nelis and said, now we'll drop the charges against your daddy if you'll drop your claim against the U.S. government. So Nelis now caught between his daddy, who's faced with prison because he probably couldn't defend himself, or dropping the claim, dropped the claim. But Dallas Qualman, having learned from that, went ahead with his claim and perfected it. And I would suppose that everyone in here could do the same, but I want to point out, no Social Security, no citizenship, and no birth certificate. If you got any of those, you cannot claim land in the United States of America because you're a ward of the government. Now that's what property and property rights are all about. Now I teach this class in our private business or professions and business class, and we also get into this subject matter of gold and silver, which I'll talk about next in our exchange class, and then I'll wrap it up today with the 64 life-threatening problems on our survival program and on our how to make $100,000 on 25 acres or less. Let's take a 10-minute break and we'll be right back. Okay, now the next topic I'm going to cover over here has to do with this thing of how to make $100,000 on 25 acres or less, which was pioneered by a black man in Alabama. His name is Professor Whatley, Tuskegee Institute. 1972, he, for some reason or some way, got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, and as a result of the Rockefeller Foundation grant, can you hear a little better now? They picked up $250,000, and their objective was to learn how, or to develop a scheme or a plan whereby poor black farmers or poor blacks that were living on the land down in the South could make a living. And they developed a heck of a neat program. And the program has been published. You probably saw it in Acres USA, or if you go to the Acres conference, etc., you've probably heard of Professor Whatley. Now, Whatley's program has been emulated throughout the United States on about 3,000 to 4,000 small economic units. And yes, it's true, a man and his wife with 2 teenagers as a labor force, that puts 4 of you to work on 25 acres, can make $100,000 a year. In some cases, you may have to hire a little bit of labor in order to help you with this or that harvest. But the routine has to do with the marketing of the product or the program rather than the growing of it. In other words, we'll assume that you can grow blue corn, but the question is, can you market it? And the marketing program has to do with private contract. Now, the Whatley people were never interested in the law of Moses, the common law, or avoiding the income tax, or in any of the topics that I teach or that we're discussing today. Their program was merely, what type of crops or program would you introduce? And the answer is, you'd grow berries, because berries are worth approximately $18,000 an acre. Blueberries are about $8,000 an acre. Raspberries run as high as $40,000 an acre. So obviously, 3 or 4 acres of raspberries would produce $100,000 a year in some crop years. But the trick is, in the marketing or the merchandising of the property, is that you can't get people to come out to pick only raspberries. People want to come out and they want to pick other things. And so when you go into a roadside stand, you don't want to buy just sweet corn. You want to be able to go in there and buy a number of other things. And so most of these roadside stands will sell watermelons and cantaloupes and peaches and pears and cherries, and they'll have a variety of fruits and vegetables that are available. So the next step was, how can you avoid the harvesting program, and that's called a U-pick operation. And then the final step, to keep this within property and to keep it out of income, is to do it under contract with private individuals. Now the question arises, how many people would participate in the program? And the answer is that when you're dealing with organically grown fruits and vegetables, there is a market for about 12% of the American people. People like myself buy organic fruits and vegetables. And you notice that we pay a premium price for that product. When you go into the store, where I'm at in Springfield, from time to time you'll see potatoes at 49 cents a pound. Now I'm from Idaho, where we grow a lot of potatoes, and the last word I got from Idaho was that the price was $2.50 a hundred. Now there's a big spread, that's $47.50 a hundred, between $2.50 in Idaho and $49 in Springfield, Missouri. Who makes that $47 spread? Well, there are jobbers, truckers, middlemen, that's the wholesalers, and then the retailers who make that differential. If I were to ask you, those of you that are into organic fruits and vegetables, if I could offer you fruits and vegetables at the same price that you were buying them for in the supermarket, would you buy them from me? Okay, and that's pretty logical, which means then that instead of me growing my potatoes and selling them for $2.50 a hundred, I'd be selling them then for 50 cents a pound, wouldn't I? Which is a substantial gain. In other words, $50 a hundred versus $2.50 a hundred is a pretty significant price. Now, I have a few students that are testing this right now. One of the students put in blue corn. Open pollinated blue corn will test 12 to 16% protein. For those of you that aren't familiar with the protein content of corn, normal hybridized corn produces 5 to 8% protein. Occasionally it'll go a little higher. Open pollinated seeds do not reproduce. I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but we're going to talk a little about this thing of survival and open pollinated seeds. Blue corn, with its higher protein content, does not produce 100 bushels to the acre. It only produces 30. But it also is right in line with open pollinated corn, because while you get more tonnage with open pollinated, with hybridized, I said open pollinated, you get more tonnage with hybridized corn. You don't get the nutrition or the food quality out of it. And I'm going to give you a few citations here and show you why that's true. And that's why 12% of us are into buying open pollinated or blue corn or organically raised fruits and vegetables. This also extends to meat and meat products such as turkeys, chickens, milk, eggs, all kinds of other products. It can also extend to vitamins and minerals if you want to use that in your store. The objective here is, once you've dropped out of society and you're no longer going to work at General Electric, what are you going to do next? So we went to work on our program here with our Barter and Exchange program, which deals with how do you actually use gold and silver as a practical medium of exchange. Now, you heard me use that, but you all know that this hotel doesn't want gold, they want Federal Reserve notes. In fact, they would prefer your credit card. They really don't even want the Federal Reserve notes if they can get a credit card from you. Well, the practical application of using gold and silver is among those people who want to buy, sell, and trade, or who want to become traders at law on a cash basis. So it's really only of practical value to me and my students. But in order for me to evade or avoid the income tax and the civil law ramifications of commerce that come down on me, the regulation and control, I have to be able to prove that I'm a trader at law on a cash basis. So what I do in my local community is I go into the Strong's hardware store and I ask the man, do you want me to pay you or do you want me to steal from you? And he said, I want to be paid. So I put a Krugerrand on the counter and he laughed and he thought, that's pretty humorous, but I've got to have real money. So I said to him, if at any time you want to be paid, that is, you want me to pay you in gold or silver, I'll do that. So I wrote him a letter, and I've written several of these letters to the power company, telephone company, Strong's Hardware, True Value Hardware, and et cetera in my community. And I said, If you people ever want to be paid in gold or silver, wheat, corn, beans, honey, or oil, I'll be happy to do that. But in my attempt, I found that you really wanted to be discharged in equity, and so I'm going to send you a postal money order or use Federal Reserve notes until I receive further instructions from your company. I have never received any further instructions. But that's fine, because as an operation of law under the Uniform Commercial Code, if I come to you and I tender payment in a debt and you refuse to accept it, the principle of law is called a maximum, and it is a maxim of law that a debt tendered and refused is a debt paid at law. What I want to do is to pay my debts at law, but you people only want to be tendered and discharged. Well, who am I to tell you people how to conduct your business? All of you people want to be partners with the Federal Reserve and the United States government. And I'm the only guy in here that doesn't want to participate in a franchise that everybody else wants to participate in. So do I have to participate in the franchise just because the majority does? And the answer is no, I don't. If that were the case, then we would all have to become Christians because 95% of the people in America are Christians. Or we would all have to be this or that, or we would all have to do this or that because that's what everybody else does, and that's not true. Where we have lost our rights are only incident to the contracts that we've signed or that we have brought ourselves into. Driver's license is a contract. You signed up for it, you have to perform on it. You got a marriage license, you signed up for it, you have to perform on it. But if at some time you decided that you wanted to regain your capacity and you wanted to drop out of the franchise, the question arises, how am I going to make a living? Which was the third indice that I needed to tell you about today. We've identified about 20 common law occupations, of which farming is one of those. But almost all of the farmers, for practical purposes, have brought themselves into commerce, while farming of and by itself is incident to land, labor, and substance, the theory being this, that if you had a piece of land and you went out and exercised your labor upon it, planted some seeds, scratched around in the dirt, and watered it, that there would be something that would grow. You'd come back later with your labor and harvest what grew, which would be your substance. Now the land, with your labor, has yielded its substance, and that's a property right, and as we've seen, it's not taxable. Now the government never taxes your property. They're not going to tax your corn. You can go out here and plant corn and get 1 million bushels of corn and then stack it up in a big pile over here and go to the IRS and say, I went out and produced 1 million bushels of corn. How much tax do I owe? And they'll tell you, well, you don't owe any tax yet, but as soon as you sell it, you'll owe tax. So you don't owe it because you produced it. You're going to owe it because now how are you going to dispose of the corn? You're going to reduce your property, the corn, into dollars, aren't you? So you're going to transfer the property to value. And they're going to tax the value. And that's an excise tax called a privilege tax or an ad valorem tax. They're going to tax the privilege. But let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that we wanted to barter and exchange. So you came to me and you said, hey, George, I want to come to your school. And how much are you going to charge me? And I said to you, I think I'll charge you 333 bushels of corn. So you take 333 bushels, load it in your truck, drive into my yard, and you say, here I am, and there's my payment. I want to pay you at law with just weights and balances. Let's weigh the corn and make sure that you got your full value. We weigh the corn and we find out that, yea, indeed, you did deliver me 333 bushels. And I'm going to deliver to you 5 days of labor. Now let me show you how this translates out. And if I'm going to give you 5 days labor, for 333 bushels, and the question arises, how much tax is due on this transaction? Can anybody compute that? Now, that's true. There's no tax due unless you've got a Social Security number. Now watch what happens. This is called fair market value. The IRS comes to you and they say, now you couldn't do this, see, because you've got a social security number, and if I came to you and I said, I want you to tutor me in English, and you get all through tutoring me over here, and I said, now I'm going to pay you in this corn, the IRS comes along and says, how much is the value of that corn? And if you said, well, the value of that corn is $1,000, they're going to say, then good, pay us $250. And you'd say, well, I didn't even get any dollars for the transaction. How can she pay $250? Well, you have to take it out of some other place because you're a member of a commercial adventure over here that deals in dollars, and you can't be enriched. This is called the doctrine of unjust enrichment. You can't be unjustly enriched without paying your contract's obligation, which is 25% of what you create and produce. But now watch what happens here. This fellow over here, now he doesn't have a social security number, and he's rescinded his birth certificate, and now he's regained his capacity. He can't work for General Motors any longer, and he comes over and he wants to trade with me. Now, we're not involved in trade, commerce, business, and industry, and we don't have any contracts to fulfill. Therefore, I'm dealing in property, and property is protected by the Constitution. We saw this, I think, last week. Even labor is protected by the 5th and 14th Amendments. But you see, once you got the Social Security number, you pledged all of your labor for all of your life. And this is what we're talking about when we deal with property. Whether it's gold or silver or corn or beans or oil or whatever it happens to be, I can negotiate the terms and conditions in dollars. In other words, we'd say, well, how much do you want for your 5 days' labor? And you'd say, oh, I want $1,000. Okay. And you'd say, well, how much do you want for 333 bushels of corn? I'd say, well, that's worth $1,000. Now, when somebody asks this fellow over here, well, now, what did you pay for that school? Well, I paid 333 bushels of corn. And you say, and then the IRS man says, well, how much was this corn worth? What was the value of the corn? Anybody know the answer to that one? 5 days of labor. And then they'll come to me and say, well, what was your 5 days of labor worth? 333 bushels of corn. If at any time you confess that it was worth $1,000, you owe the tax. Because the dollars are a copyrighted trademark of the Federal Reserve. They own it. Well, now, they didn't always own it, but they came into possession of it under the Coinage Act of 1964. Watch what happened. Have you ever seen this symbol like this? Yeah. This is the 1792 Coinage Act. And this U was a United States coin. That's what that meant. This is a United States dollar. Well, in 1862, the symbol was changed to this under the Greenback Act. Now, I don't remember the terms or conditions of this act or the name of it, but if you want all the coinage acts of the United States, the book that has all of them is called Pieces of Eight, and the guy's name is Richard, no, it isn't either, it's Edwin, E-D-W-I-N, Vieira, V-I-E-R-R-A, Edwin Vieira. And he's put all the coinage acts of the United States in here. And under the Greenback Act of 1862, there's a modification of the symbol. Now, when I was a boy, this was the symbol that was still being used when I went to school in 1945. But it changed right after that. And the change occurred because of the 1933 HJR 192 Act. It's a House Joint Resolution. Do you remember this, used in the 50s and 60s? Then, do you remember that it changed again? And the way you take a look at this is look at the old typewriters and go into a museum where they've got typewriters and just run over and look at all the old typewriters and look at the dollar symbol on them. And in the 60s, the dollar symbol changed to this. Do you remember this symbol? This came about in 1964. And this went on for a few years, and then something happened to this symbol. You never see it anymore, do you? All you see is a line. So when you get a tax form, just take a look and see what the blanks call for. They don't call for dollars, they call for lines. Well, what happened here was that the Federal Reserve Bank copyrighted this symbol right here. It's called the dollar sign. Now, over the years, there's been an evolution of this dollar sign from the U.S. Treasury to the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Federal Reserve Bank owns this. Now, the word dollar in reality is a generic term. You know, it's like sun. You know, the sun is a generic term. I can't copyright the word sun unless I use the word sun in a copyrightable product. And so the Federal Reserve turns out these Federal Reserve notes, and this is a copyrightable product that they own. Now, the Canadians also make dollars, and they have a copyrightable product. This is a Canadian dollar. It's $1 Canada. It's issued by the Corporation of Canada. And this is a Federal Reserve note, and it comes from the United States of America. So it's a United States corporate note. So it's a corporation of the United States that issues that note. Now, we've discussed property, and now we see over here that the Federal Reserve has copyrighted the dollar. And the dollar is a trademark just like Coca-Cola. Now, what they're supposed to do is to put a circle here and put an R in here every time you see the word dollar. But hell, if they did that, it would be like cancer. What if you saw the word cancer and somebody put a circled trademark? Wouldn't that tell you that this is commercial? All right. So the Federal Reserve doesn't come down on you and prosecute you for copyright infringement when you use the word dollar, and neither does the AMA when you use the word cancer. They're not prosecuting you when you go out and heal cancer. They're not prosecuting you for copyright infringement. They prosecute you for practicing medicine without a license. Now, if you went out here and you made some of these dollars, they call that counterfeiting, not a copyright infringement. And they charge a commission or a tax on the use of those dollars. Now, when we get into private business, then you can see how important it is that you maintain your private business and keep it totally separate from public, and that's why you can't use the word dollar. A dollar is a commercial instrument, and it's copyrighted and trademarked, and if you're going to use it, you got to pay a commission for it in the same way that you would if you took any other copyrighted material or Coca-Cola or any other thing that has a copyright or trademark on it.
Is there a legal way to make silver 1 ounce slugs yourself?
Yes, you can make them in the morning. No problem. In fact, there's 1,000 mints operating in the United States right now that are turning out silver rounds. And when I go to California and Alaska, you'll find a lot of those miners who make their own gold ingots. They just make them up in 1 ounce, you know.
Registered thing, the gold bars have to be registered, or?
Who told you that?
Oh, I saw a thing that gave you the idea, or an article or something.
Well, no, that's not true. See, gold is a property right. In fact, there's no tax on raw gold. The tax doesn't apply to gold until it's been minted or refined or smelted. And here's the crazy part of it. You go to Alaska, and these miners up there, they go out and they dig out 100 ounces of gold. What do they do with it? They take it down to the bank and trade it in for Federal Reserve notes and obligate themselves to a tax. You know, in 1900, we had a little store. It was a pretty good-sized mercantile store in Fort Bragg, California, and there's a creek north of there, 17 mile, called. You take that ounce of gold, or excuse me, not an ounce, you get $1 worth of gold out. Well, you take that $1 worth of gold and save it up, and in 20 days you'd have about an ounce. Well, you could take that gold down to the well, we call them a grocery store today, and they would take that gold and weigh it on a gold scale. Now, when I was a little boy in 1945, that gold scale was still sitting on the counter. Nobody had used it for many years. Even in 1945, nobody was spending any time getting gold, but the scale was still there, and explained to me how it worked. So you'd come into the store, and you just weigh it out. And you may have seen this in the movies. You know, a guy reaches in his pocket and pulls out his little pouch, and he wants to buy drinks for everybody, and they just weigh it out. You know, the drinks are over here, they're $20, and so it takes an ounce of gold because gold was $20 an ounce. Now that's the way you settled your debt. Now the gold was property, and the guy in the store, after he collected a certain amount of it, would take it down to the mint in San Francisco, and they would charge him 1%, and they would refine it down. Now gold, when it comes out of the creek, is only 75% pure. But then they would mint it down to a coin, and after they've smelted it, it comes out to 9999 fine. That's called 4 nines fine. And a 4-9 fine coin means that in 10,000 of these coins, there's only 1 ounce of dross. All the rest of it's fine gold. Now, that's the way it worked. But you know, to this day, those laws are still on the books. In legal theory, I could take my raw gold to the San Francisco Mint, and they'll still mint it down for me and turn it into these coins. Now, why those miners don't do that, I don't know. In fact, a few of them will go in to buy a backhoe, and they'll negotiate a private deal in raw gold with the guy with the backhoe to pay for it. But most of them sell it to the government and then incur a tax liability from it. Now, why don't we just buy, sell, and trade with our own property? Why do we need to bring the Federal Reserve in? Well, isn't the answer because it's the only thing we know? Nobody has ever done any business in gold, silver, wheat, corn, beans, honey, and oil. All you know is dollars. And you learned that from the public school. And I'm not telling you it's a bad system. It's a hell of a nice system. It's just that the cost of doing business is 17 to 75% of all of your transactions. And the more transactions you make and the more dollar volume you use, then the greater is the commission liability that you incur. All right, let's take a look at open pollinated versus hybridized seed for a minute.
What would happen if people, everybody in the United States, free enterprise, went to the barter system? What would happen to the governmental system?
George Washington answered that question in 1792 when he wrote a letter to James Madison. He said, "You can't believe the difference in the fortunes of the colonies and the commerce that has been thriving since we've gone from the continental currency to hard currency." When we start dealing in gold and silver, wheat, corn, beans, honey, and oil, you will see a marked and dramatic increase in the wealth that you accumulate. You'll see that, I would say this, that in 36 months you should have $100,000 in gold buried in a hole in the ground anytime that you make the conversion from paper to substance. You know, the median income in the United States now is right at $35,000. So if you make $35,000, you're right at the average. Well, $35,000 for 3 years is $100,000. If you deal in property, for instance, people come to me and they trade their labor. I've had a lot of people trade labor, so I can go down and I can look at fences that have been built and works that have been accomplished on my farm that are done directly with labor. Or I've traded wire, cattle, sheep, goats, chickens. And then I can go out and look at my cows and sheep and chickens and goats, and I can say, well, I've traded for those. And then those animals multiply. Pretty soon you got lots of chickens, lots of goats, and lots of cattle. You know, that's just the way of life, and it's the way things go. So the same thing is true when you're dealing in automobiles and other things. You're going to find out that your wealth will begin to increase. Your substance begins to increase at a very rapid rate. Pretty soon you won't have enough buildings to put all this stuff in. You'll have to build more buildings. Let me talk to you for a moment about, this is a book put out called Seed Savers Exchange, the first 10 years, 75 to 85. I'm going to read to you some comments that are made here concerning this thing of open pollinated seeds, and I'm going to tell you a little story about it. The wheat stem rust, which took 65% of the Durham wheat crop in 1953, and 75% of it in 54, and 25% of the bread wheat in that same year, or the southern corn blight of 1970, are only early warnings of the value of genetic diversity and the liability of genetic uniformity. Dr. Erna Bennett of the Crop Ecology and Genetic Resources Unit of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, called FAO, in Rome estimates that by 1991, fully 3/4 of all of the vegetable varieties now grown in Europe will be extinct due to the attempt to enforce plant patenting laws. Now that's a pretty dramatic statement. That's next year. Fully 3/4 of all of the vegetable varieties in Europe will become extinct. Well, let me tell you that by today, beginning in 1900, there are over 5,000 varieties of vegetable plants that are extinct on planet Earth today, and you probably never heard a word about it. You heard a lot about the California condor. But let me ask you this. How many of you have ever eaten a condor? How many of you plan to eat one? But don't you eat beets and cucumbers and corn and carrots and cabbage? Now I know a lot of people say, well, listen, I went in the store the other day and there seemed to be plenty of peas on the shelf. Well, in the United States, 97% of all of the peas in commercial production come from 4 varieties. As recently as 1700, there were over 200 varieties of peas in the United States. Now, for one reason or another, they're not commercially viable. When I was a boy in 1942, 3, 5, 7, we had what we call victory gardens. And everybody in Corbell, California had a garden, and everybody had his own seed varieties. Now, the corn that you had was probably a different variety from that fellow and on around over here. But everybody had corn. Everybody had peas. Everybody had beans, and etc. And there were different varieties. And the importance of that is that if a particular pest gets into this guy's corn, and this lady over here has blue corn, and this guy has sweet corn, and his sweet corn's being ravaged, they don't bother the blue corn over here. When everybody in the community plants the same variety of corn and the pest gets into his, it moves from his to yours and wipes out all of them. This is why we need DDT. So if you're wondering why it is that we have to have chemical sprays to control insect infestations, it's caused by monoculture. Because it is not economical on a commercial basis to grow 200 varieties of peas in one locality. But it is economically viable to plant one open or closed pollinated variety over a large area of land, and then if an insect comes along, we'll spray him with DDT. Well, now you know there are some problems with sprays, and there are some problems with chemical fertilizers. Let's take a look at another one. I am a concerned scientist who has spent the last 5 years of my professional career involved with plant variety protection. I consider the Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970 to be inappropriately named. It protects big business, not plant varieties, which are crucial but threatened resources. And I see such restrictive legislation as putting into private control resources which have developed and should continue to develop as part of the public domain. Such legislation gives credence to the breeders who manipulate 1 or 2 genes of a traditional land race and then lock up the genetic resources of a crop, which has evolved over thousands of years. Privately employed plant breeders can even cross 2 varieties derived from many years of genetic research done by the USDA or other private universities. Then they can patent the hybrid as their own creation. To let a private company control for 18 years genetic material that was developed largely by others is to inequitably favor such opportunistic businesses. And the 1970 Act and this proposed amendment are nightmares to enforce, since it is so difficult to technically define and verify what plant varieties are. Now this scientist goes on to point out a problem. I'm also opposed to any attempt to alter the provisions of the 1970 Act to be in accordance with UPOV or UPOV members have actually made the growing of certain valuable traditional varieties illegal, further restricting our genetic base. And this one fellow over here who is a small seed company in Britain, and they're talking about British law now, the United States of Europe. But I want to point out, in 1972, this legislation was brought to the United States, and Senator Frank Church from Idaho sponsored it. And it's been in operation since 1972, just 2 years after it was enacted on the continent of Europe. What this is coming to mean is famine in the United States. That's what we're leading up to. But let me show you how it's coming to pass. This one seed company is an illustration in England that's used in the article. Was using a variety of onion that had been around for several hundred years. So one seed company come along and took that particular variety that had been around for a long time, open pollinated, and hybridized it. When they hybridized it, they patented it. Well, now they patented it and hung a label on it. Well, this small company over here is still producing the old variety, aren't they? So the company comes along and files suit against the old company that's been producing the old open pollinated variety for infringing on their patent and put them out of business. How's that? Now that's what's coming in the United States, because all of us buy our food from the grocery store. Well, the grocery store got it from the supplier, the wholesaler, and the wholesaler in turn got it from the packager, and that was Keebler, and that was probably supplied by one of the five sisters. It was either Cargill or one of the grain companies that contracted with the farmer to grow it. If you were over here at the Coors Beer Company the other day, you'll notice that Coors contracts with a farmer to grow that barley. And he's under contract then to produce it. Well, that's what the big grain companies do. So the farmer, he doesn't care whether that barley is open pollinated or hybridized. It's irrelevant to him. He gets paid for growing barley. So he goes over here to the seed company, Northrop King, and he buys the hybridized barley, and he grows the barley, and he sells it to Coors, and that's all he cares about. But in the process of doing that, we take competition from thousands of farmers selling their particular varieties of barley, and we reduce it to a least common denominator until we've eliminated all of the varieties save for 3 or 4. And that's where you are with wheat, corn, beans. There's only a few commercial varieties that are used, and then they're hybridized for this purpose. A hybridized seed will not reproduce. It's a eunuch. So if you were to go down to the hardware store and you buy a package of corn and you go home and you plant it and you say, well, if worse comes to worse, I'll just save some of the seed off of this corn over here and I'll replant it. No, you won't. It won't grow. Well, it'll grow, but it won't produce. And we had this happen to us. I had a great big squash plant out in my greenhouse, and I said, well, look at all the flowers on that squash. Why, I'll bet you that thing is really going to be a producer. It grew there for about another 6 or 8 weeks, produced thousands of blossoms and not one squash. Hell of a nice looking plant. It was a hybridized seed that accidentally got planted in the greenhouse somehow and produced a wonderful plant with no produce. Now for the seed company, that's wonderful, because corn that sells for $3 a bushel to the seed company as hybridized seed, that seed company produces the fertile seed and sells it back to the farmer for $60 a bushel. Now that's good business. And the farmer who raises this hybridized corn has to always go back and buy the $60 a bushel seed in order to go out and plant the seeds. Now watch what's happening. In the 1970s and 80s, the petrochemical companies, among which is Royal Dutch Shell, have bought up virtually every seed company on planet Earth. So now when you get a seed catalog and it says Northrop King, it's a corporation that's held by the master holding company, Royal Dutch Shell. And Shell Oil is the largest supplier of seed on planet Earth. followed by Arco, Standard Oil, Exxon, Mobil, and Tenneco. Now, why would the big oil companies want to control the seed? I mean, it sounds like it's kind of a preposterous business adventure. But remember, the hybridized seed are dependent upon tremendous amounts of irrigation, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides. And what do the big chemical companies produce? They produce the fertilizers and the pesticides. So it's in their interest to have everybody planting hybridized seed. It's just a marketing program. But the uniformity that is created from these monocultures spells disaster. And those of you that have been raised perhaps with a little Bible instruction, do you remember the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? Do you remember the pale horse, the one that deals with famine? Well, do you see what's beginning to happen on planet Earth? We'll start now with the 1970s and the miracle rice that was taken from the development in the United States over to the Philippines, Japan, China. They took it over there, and it requires a tremendous amount of irrigation. So now you got to irrigate the stuff, and you got to chemically fertilize it. And those countries do not have the wherewithal to buy the chemical fertilizers from the have countries, and so now these third world countries are upside down. And what brought the bankruptcy was the use of these hybridized seed. Hybrids are profitable because the farmer or the gardener must return yearly to the seed company for more seed, whereas he could save the seed of a standard variety. While hybrid corn is often markedly more productive, standard tomatoes and peppers may be a little different from their hybrid counterparts. We've tested 1,000 or so different hybrids, but none of these are equal to the best standard varieties of tomatoes, says Dr. Ernest Kerr of the Simcoe, Ontario Research Station. Genetic wipeout puts the whole food system at risk and places first and third world farmers in the hands of just a few multinational agrochemical and petrochemical companies. Royal Dutch Shell has become the world's largest seed and agricultural supply company. The catalog is inspired by commercial interests and is intended to clear the European market for patented varieties. These are issues which cannot be trusted to the profit motive. If you control the seed, the beginning of the food system, you can control the entire system. The government has no right or reason to turn over control of the Canadian food system to multinational agrochemical companies. And Bob Berglund, the Secretary of Agriculture, the prediction that by 1991, 3/4 of all vegetable varieties grown now will be extinct may prove to be correct. Obsolete varieties are being replaced by improved varieties adapted to extended areas of agriculture. In a letter from Senator Frank Church, who introduced the Senate amendment, there is absolutely nothing in this legislation which would make it against the law to grow garden vegetables. Neither does this legislation have anything to do with promoting uniform varieties of plants. The legislation bears no resemblance to what is done overseas. Plant variety protection has worked to protect the new varieties developed by the small seed companies against exploitation by bigger seed companies. The result of the 1970 Act have been beneficial. The numbers and types of varieties of plants have expanded. Competition to breed new seeds has apparently increased. Be assured that I would not introduce legislation to outlaw certain seeds, banish backyard gardens, or force genetic uniformity and hand over big profits to a few seed companies. That's what Senator Frank Church had to say when he introduced the legislation in the United States Senate. Since 1972, fully 90% of the seed companies of the United States have been taken over by the multinational agrochemical companies.
Who owns Royal Dutch Shell?
Rothschilds. That's a Rothschild operation. It is quite apparent that they are literally fabricating statistics to prove their case. We are very concerned because it is difficult to counter such tactics. There have been 42 companies, public and private enterprises, that have been involved in soybean breeding in the United States since 1970. Of those 42 companies, 25 had programs prior to the passage of this 1972 legislation. That's clear because they had applied for their patents very quickly after the bill passed, and everybody says that it takes at least 7 or 8 years to develop a new variety. So we assume that all of the applications prior to 1977, in fact, were passed on research before the bill was passed. How many of those companies are still plant breeding out of the 42? Well, 15 of the 25 that were plant breeding in the beginning of the 70s aren't there anymore. They've canceled their programs out of the new ones that have come into the market. The only new only in the sense that they applied for their first patent in 1977. Half of those new ones haven't done anything since 1980. In fact, if you look at it, and I've looked at each major crop in the United States, you're going to see a drop-off in every major crop that has been patented since the beginning of the program. That is called monopoly. That's what multinationals do, and that's what patents do. Patents are simply a way in which you can carve up your turf, declare your territory, and keep the little guys out of it. Patents are a barrier to entry for small countries, and they're the way that multinationals divide up their market shares, and that's what's happening in the seed business. Now, to show you how this is going to come down, there's going to come a point in time when you go down here to the hardware store to buy seeds, and all that will be available will be the hybrids that you can buy from the seed companies. Now, there are a few of us. There are approximately 5,000 people left in the United States who still have open pollinated varieties of seeds. I'm one of those, and I'm called a seed saver. How many of you in this room have the seeds that you need to plant and grow your own food for the rest of your life? There's 3 of us, 4 of us. If I went to a normal audience, and you people certainly are not normal, or you wouldn't be here, you wouldn't have anybody. Nobody in his right mind even grows a garden. It's too expensive, and you can buy the food so much cheaper, and who wants to spend all that time weeding the carrots? But I can produce and take the seed from my production and keep it from year to year. But you can't do that when you buy your seed from the seed company, and we're now down to just a few small seed companies that still produce some open pollinated seed. They're not all gone. 90% of them are gone, but there's a few left. Now watch what's happening to them. If they won't sell out, then they will be forced out, just like they did in Europe. All the big company has to do is to take an open pollinated variety, hybridize it, patent it, and then claim that the smaller company with the open pollinated variety has a patent infringement. And that's the end of it. Now you can sell, or we'll have a court to put you out of business. Now when this finally runs its course, and every seed producer that's producing open pollinated seed has been put out of business, then only the big companies will be left, and they will not sell you open pollinated seed because they know that if they sell it to you, you can save the seed and keep it from year to year. So they're going to take it off the market. Now just take a look at any plant seed catalog, and you'll find that there's probably 90 hybrids for every 10 open pollinators, maybe more. Now I've been watching this since 1980, so I've been watching this go on for 10 years. Let me tell you, the results have been absolutely phenomenal. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyeballs, I wouldn't have believed it possible that open pollinated seed could disappear from the marketplace in 10 years. Now let me tell you another fact that maybe you didn't know. I'm from agriculture. I'm an ag graduate. I studied agriculture and went into the dairy business when I was a youngster. When I was a kid back in the 50s, America was awash with so much butter And so much milk and powdered milk, we didn't know what to do with it. So we went to the government and said, well, you guys buy it up and stock it for us, so we don't have to kill all these cows that we've spent 150 years in genetic engineering to produce. And so the government did that, and as they bought up all those surpluses, America had gigantic surpluses that you could then give away in free school lunches. No big problem. Well, starting in 1980, the United States began to import more food than it exported. Now, you've always heard that America was a great exporter of food. It's always been that way. 1980 started a trend. Well, today, in 1990, 35% of everything that you eat in America comes from overseas. 35%. That is absolutely phenomenal. And that's occurred in just 10 years. Now, one of these days, the United States is going to be importing 50, 60, or 70% of its food. And when that time comes, and you're no longer able to pay your import bill, those people that are producing it are going to shut it off. And you're going to have instant rationing. You'll need a ration card to go to the grocery store. Now, the Iraqis are going to find out just exactly what an embargo is all about. Because if it's true that those people can't get anything in, then it's not going to be very long until they run out of potatoes and potato chips and cucumbers and the other things that they grow. And they don't grow very much out there in that desert. They grow a little, but they don't grow a whole lot. They import 70% of their food. So they're going to find out a valuable lesson about self-sufficiency. Now, I'm self-sufficient. I have a few cows and a few chickens and a few turkeys and a few of these and that and another thing, and I have some raised beds, and I grow, and I have the seeds. And a question arises as to just how much food or how much in the way of supplies do you need to stockpile. You've probably heard about survivalists and people who are in this survival thing over here, and the Mormons stock a year or 2 years supply of food. But have you ever heard of anybody that ever sat down and said, well, why would I stock a 1-year supply? Why not 18 months? Why not 2 years? Why not 6 months or 3 months? Why is it 1 year? I've never had anybody tell me the answer. I've asked people, how much do you have? Well, once in a while you'll run across a Mormon and he's got a year's supply, and you ask the fellow, well, why a year? How come you don't have 2 years like a lot of other Mormons? And he says, well, seems like a year's supply is enough. And I said, well, what documentation did you go to? Did you go to the encyclopedia? And was there an article in there that told you that you needed a 1-year supply? Well, no. Well, did you get it from the Department of Agriculture? Well, no. Did you get it from the church? Well, kind of. But you see, nobody ever tells you. Now, doesn't it appear that you need to have some kind of a guideline? I mean, you know, one guy's got a year. What if the famine goes on for 2 years and you've got a 1-year supply? What does that tell you? Well, it reminded me of the Anne Frank story. Do you remember the little girl that went into hiding in 1939 and she survived to 1944, and then they captured her, deported her to a concentration camp and killed her? God, that was a tragic story. They had survived in that attic for 5 years and got caught 9 months before safety. In 9 more months, the war was over. So I sat down and I said, my God, do you understand what that means? She failed in her mission. Her mission was to survive World War II, and she failed 9 months before the success. It's like being the last man killed on the Western Front. You know, you either survive or you don't. You make it or you don't make it. So it raised a question in my mind. I said, well, I see all these people running around out here publishing articles, and they're survivalists, and they claim to be survivalists. And what is it that, what's the first item that you need in survival? Isn't it an Uzi? That's the first thing they tell you. What's the second thing you need? Bullets? Camouflage suits? You know, I took a look at that and I said, well, yeah, I guess if I was going to go to war, I guess the first thing I need is a gun. But if I was starving to death, what's the first thing I need? I said, I don't need a gun, do I? So then I said to myself, well, my God, I don't think very many people have put their minds to the problem of survival in a logical and a systematic methodology to identify just what the problem is. So I said, okay, it looks like to me that food could be a problem. I mean, you know, if you're importing 35% of your food today and it moved up to 70 and you had a trade embargo, I could see where rationing could come into play. That little problem in Germany, you remember, 1944, 45, 46. So I said, let's suppose that we could get over that one over there, but then what about the problem of war? What about the problem of AIDS? So you got thermonuclear war, you got AIDS. Remember, there were 4 of these. So you got war, famine, pestilence, and disease. So you got plagues and disease. Well, if you die from cancer next year, I guess you don't need to worry about the plague of AIDS, do you? And if you died from AIDS next year, then you don't need to worry about thermonuclear war, do you? So it suddenly dawned on me that, my God, there are some problems out here in the real world, and if the problems don't go away or aren't solved in some manner, and I get caught up in them, I could get killed. So I thought, well, my gosh, how many of these problems are there? Because if I fail to identify the number of problems, let's suppose I thought there was 30, but there's really 35. So I prepare for all 30 of them, and God, I solved 30, but I got run over by a dump truck because I didn't learn how to cross the street. Well, then what the hell was all my work and effort for? So it reminded me of this story, and I've related it over the years. Pay attention. You remember the story of the Titanic? You probably saw the book and read the movie, didn't you? And now you remember that the ship sunk on its maiden voyage, so it never did get from land to land. It just got from land to the bottom of the ocean. 1,500 victims and 800 survivors. What if I came to you 2 days before the ship sank, and I said to you, listen, I just had a vision last night, and this ship is going to hit an iceberg at 23 knots in a big ice pack which is dead ahead of us, and the captain's trying to set this new transatlantic record, and the ship is going to get a 300-foot hole in the starboard side and sink to the bottom of the ocean in an hour and 50 minutes. How many of you would believe me? Well, first of all, everybody'd look at you like you're some kind of a lunatic. Now, assuming that we were all down in the bar drinking together, and I said to you, hey, listen, I don't think this ship's going to get to the other side. Let's go back in a time warp. All of us in this room will do this. Now, we're all on board the Titanic, and it's April the 12th now. We're just 2 days ahead of it, and we all come out, and there it is. There's a life ring, and it says SS Titanic on it. So we walk up to the first purser that comes along, and we say, hey, you, come here. What's the name of this ship? And the guy looks at you like you're a little nut, and he says, why, this is the Titanic. And you say, what is the date? And he says, it's April 12th. No, fool. What year is this? He looks at you like you're a nut, and he says, why, 1912. Now, here you are on the Titanic. You've read the book, you saw the movie, and you got 48 hours. Do you think you could save yourself from the impending disaster? What would you do? Lady up there says, no. Would you try? What would your first move be? Excuse me, ma'am? We just left Ireland 8 hours ago. Last stop. Yeah, of course, see, if we'd have known ahead of time, we wouldn't have got on. Well, that's where the SS America is, but unfortunately, we were all born on board the SS America, and the question is of whether or not this ship is going to reach its ultimate goal, peace and prosperity in the great new world tomorrow. I'm a little bit concerned about this ship. I've been concerned about this $200 billion a year debt. I'm concerned about this $100 billion a year trade deficit. I wonder how long those Japanese are going to send Toyotas over here for pieces of paper. I'm surprised that they're still sending them over here. And I'll assure you that we can turn out more of these pieces of paper than they can turn out Toyotas. Now, I don't know how long they're going to do that, but there's going to come a point in time, I predict, Always remember, Gordon predicts that those Japs are going to tell you that if we don't get something back from you, like wheat, corn, beans, honey, oil, Caterpillar tractors or something else, we ain't sending you any more Toyota. Now I imagine the Mexicans are going to do the same thing, because you know, if they don't get paid for their tomatoes, cucumbers, and carrots that they ship up here, and their grapes and bananas and etc., there's going to come a point in time, I think those boys are going to say, we ain't sending any more. And when that happens, then I have to face the reality of the problem of survival. And if that's the case, then I got to be one of the survivors, because I really didn't have many plans to die. I wanted to live forever. Now let's go back to our Titanic scenario. Number one, you wouldn't have got on it, but now that we're on it, isn't the first objective to warn the captain, the fellow who can slow the ship down or turn it around or steer south? Oh my God, isn't that what all you people have been doing? Didn't you join the John Birch Society? And so that you could write letters to Frank Church and tell him what the problem of genetic engineering was all about? Yes. Didn't you write President Reagan and President Ford and President Nixon and tell them about the Federal Reserve and the evils of paper money and the IRS and the abuses that were going on? Didn't you tell the captain? What did he do? Did it ever occur to you that the captain was working for the White Star Line? He wasn't working for the passengers? Now, let me tell you something maybe you didn't know. I looked into the payment schedule on the White Star Line. They built that ship for about $5 million. They settled for $5.5 million. There were 1,500 victims that shared $600,000 among them. The sinking of the Titanic was the single most profitable crossing of the Atlantic that the White Star ever experienced. They made $500,000 on the wreck, and it didn't even get all the way across. From their perspective, limited liability in a maritime contract is the greatest thing since sliced white bread. If the ship makes it all the way across, we load it up with passengers and send it back. And we just keep doing that until we finally hit an iceberg. But if we can hit the iceberg on the first time around, man, we made $500,000 on the crossing. We were paid for the ship. They got $5 million for the ship. And all the passengers, 1,500 victims, got $600,000. Didn't seem quite right, did it? That's the way the game's played, and that's the way it came down. So I don't think the captain, and get this, Bruce Inmay, the owner of the White Star Line, is on the ship when it's crossing. Don't you suppose that when they got those messages that there was a 5,000 square mile field of icebergs out there, the heaviest concentration of ice field in history up to 1912, don't you suppose the captain had that right in his pocket? Don't you remember the movie? Why, sure. Didn't he talk to the owner? Didn't somebody say, well, gosh, if we hit one of those icebergs over there, maybe the ship would sink? Well, wait a minute, haven't you read the material? The ship's unsinkable. Don't you remember? It's got watertight compartments, 7 of them. Of course, nobody quite envisioned this ship hitting the iceberg and then ripping a 300-foot hole through 4 of those compartments. You could float with any 2 of them full of water, but, you know, when you filled 4 of them, that was the end of the argument. Then there was one last flaw in the design of the ship. Were you aware that all of the watertight bulkheads were not sealed at the top? That's right. All the bulkheads, all 7 of them, had watertight doors, and they weren't sealed at the top because it was another $150,000 to seal those. So when one compartment filled up, it just spilled over the top into the next one and so on down the line until the ship sank. But if I would have walked up and told the captain that I've seen the book, or seen the movie and read the book, and told him what the outcome was going to be, what do you think the captain would say to me? I think he'd hand me 2 tickets to the A-Deck Lounge and tell me to go down and have a couple of Jack Daniels on the rocks on the White Star Line. Sit back and relax, you're in safe hands. This captain's been at sea for 39 years. Man, this is my last crossing. I'm going to retire next year. Well, that's the way the game came down. Now, from my perspective, it would seem logical to me that perhaps what I ought to do is to lash some deck chairs together. So I'm going to go up to the bow of the ship, and I'm going to lash 27 deck chairs together, and then I'm going to go up to the chief purser, and I'm going to upgrade my ticket from third class to second. And Lifeboat 6 is the first one off, and it's going to go off at 12 o'clock midnight, and this ship's going to hit the iceberg at 20 minutes to 12. Where am I going to be standing at 11:30? Right in front of Lifeboat 6. Now, there were a few male survivors off of there, but all the males got off on Lifeboat 6, and that was the first lifeboat off. And when everybody came up and said, abandon ship, how many people got into the first lifeboat? Not very many. I think 28 was the total number, because you see, when you looked over the side, you ever seen the Queen Mary? Well, the Queen Mary is about that size. Man, it's 5 stories from the restaurant down to the water. It'd kill you jumping over the side. Nobody in his right mind would get off there. Where am I going to put my 27 deck chairs? Which end of the boat? Don't they go up in the bow? Up in the stern? What's the matter for you? The ship sinks by the bow, remember? Didn't you see the movie? All right, now the ship's going to sink by the bow. Now as the ship sinks down about 60 or 70 feet and the bow is about level with the water, where are all the people running? They're running where? They're running to the stern, right? Which way am I headed? To the bow. So don't I have to, excuse me, pardon me, ma'am, let me through, please. What are the people going to be saying to me? You're a nut, you fool. It's underwater. Flee to the stern. Flee for your life. Pardon me, let me through, please. Now, is this the time that I want to say, hey, wait a minute, follow me. I've got a lifeboat up in the bow. What do you think my chances of survival are going to be now? All right, now, why don't we use our heads? If the United States of America is $200 billion a year short on its budget and $3 trillion in debt, which only covers the tip of the iceberg, you're over $30 trillion in debt, and there's no way that we could pay this off if we all went to work in the morning and tried to do it. And at some point in time, this thing is going to come to an end. I think everybody is pretty well convinced. I don't think anybody talking about the brighter, sunnier world of the 21st century for the United States. Are they? Nobody I talk to. I mean, you'd have to be in New York on the lower end of Manhattan on Wall Street with your head stuck between your knees or something to believe that. So I said, well, it's kind of like the Roman Empire. You know, the Roman Empire one day existed, and it was the world's preeminent power. And one day it ceased to exist, didn't it? I mean, Rome doesn't run world affairs today, does it? And haven't there been empires that have come and gone, like the Babylonian Empire and the Macedonian, Persian Empire, and the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Romans? All these people in turn have at one time amassed gigantic empires. The American Empire was great and all-encompassing at one point in time. But now are you witnessing a disintegration? Let me show you what the disintegration is all about. In 1950, at the apex of American power and influence, there were 15 leading economic indicators, of which the United States of America was number 1 in all 15. Isn't that amazing? You take iron and steel production, auto production, rubber production, aluminum and aircraft production, you take all these economic, or all of these industrial bellwethers. In 1950, America was number 1, and everybody else in the world combined couldn't match our productive capacity. Listen to a couple of numbers. We produced 100 million tons of steel in 1950 for the first time, and everybody else in the world combined produced 27 million tons. We produced 3.5 million automobiles, and everybody else in the world combined produced 750,000. As of today, we're still number 1 in one of those 15 leading economic indicators, aircraft production, and the United States of Europe will become number 1 in 1992, 2 years away, and will become number 2. Wouldn't you say something pretty dramatic has occurred in the United States in just the last 40 years? You know, Henry Kaiser was launching one Liberty ship a day. That's 365 a year out of the Richmond shipyard in Richmond, California. And in 1990, the United States of America cannot maintain a 600-ship Navy. What went wrong? What happened? Well, something pretty dramatic has occurred, and if you'll take a look at your monetary system, in 1900 you had gold and silver, in 1990 you've got paper, in 1900 you were preeminent and rising, and in 1990 you're a has-been in decline. Can I tell you a little story? Now the general consensus of opinion is that all of us have to band together and go to the captain and warn him of what's going on. Did you think President Bush is ignorant? Do you think he's a fool? Do you think that he is so out of touch with reality that he doesn't know what I've just told you? Have I told you something that you really didn't know? By going to the captain and telling him that he's steaming into an ice field is the wrong guy to tell. He's in on the plan to destroy the ship because there's profits to be made. When the world is carved up and the American empire is divided between Europe, Japan, and Mexico, the powers that be will still be in control of the steel mill in South Korea. They'll still be in control of the Boeing Aircraft Company in Seattle. It's just the political and the demographics will be changed. Now that doesn't sound too good to me, but then, you know, to the guy that's living in London or Tokyo, he doesn't care how America is politically carved up. It's not relevant to him. It is to me. So now what we're going to do is I'll tell you what, we'll go to the crew members. We'll go out here and we'll tell Frank Church and we'll write letters to our legislators and our senators, and I'll go into the State House and I'll tell all of my representatives and all of my state senators what's going on. By God, we'll have a grassroots move and we'll change things. Did you test that one? I did. You want to know how that worked? They just puke on you. The committee chairman, he might pat you on your little pointed head and say, now, be a good little boy, go on home. You're in safe hands with Senator Ulrich. But didn't accomplish very much. So one day I woke up and I said, hey, wait a minute. When this ship sinks, the captain and the crew are not going to be over here bailing to save it. In fact, they're the guys that are busily pouring on more steam to go a little bit faster so that when we hit this iceberg, there's no slip-ups. This ship's going to the bottom. So I thought, well, I better figure out a way to get off this ship then, because we've already left Ireland, and the next stop is the bottom of the Atlantic, and there's only victims and survivors. Now that's the bright spot, because you know in every one of these collapses, let's take Nazi Germany, 1945. 15% of the people who were living in Berlin in 1935 were still living there in 1945. How would you have liked to have lived for those 10 years in Berlin, Germany? Hey, that wasn't a very good place, was it? Did you know a lot of people left Germany in 1935, and Albert Einstein was one of them? Yeah, a lot of people, they took a look around at the political and the sociological and economic considerations of the day, and they said, you know, this isn't a good place. I think I'll go to Switzerland. I think I'll pull up and get the hell out of here. And those guys lived to die of old age. Albert Einstein died back in the 60s over in New Jersey, didn't he? Died of old age. How long do you think he would have lived if he'd have stayed in Germany? Well, I don't know, but a lot of them didn't make it. Same thing's true here in the United States. There are going to be victims and there are going to be survivors. Now let's get back to the 64 life-threatening problems, because that's what we all got to face. So I said, I've got to have an authoritative source, so I went to an affidavit called the Holy Bible, the Scripture, to find out if there was an authority someplace that could predict or claim to predict what could be occurring in the next 20, 30, 50 years. And I said to myself, well, gee, let's suppose there's no famine for the next 30 years, and I've stockpiled a 4-year supply. So what? The worst that you can say is, you fool, you nitwit, you stocked a 4-year supply of food. Why, in my house to this day, I've got shelves over here where you put the cans in the back and pull them off the front. So instead of having $10,000 in the Bank of Gainesville, I have $10,000 in peas, corn, beans, wheat, corn, oil, etc. And I just go over here and I pull it out. When I go to the store to buy something, I don't buy 3 cans, I buy 3 cases. When I get through with those 3 cases, I buy 3 more. And I always keep a 4-year supply on hand. Now, why 4 years? Well, I went to Daniel 10 and I went to Revelation 18, and I found out that this thing, when it comes to fruition, is called the day of the Lord. And it's going to last 1,335 days. So I said, gee, what would happen if I got cut off from the Safeway store for 1,335 days? Then it told me I ought to have 1,335 days stocked over here, assuming that I couldn't grow anymore because I couldn't get any seed, or because for some reason there was drought or there was flood or some other problem. So at least I've got an authoritative source that says the answer to how many days famine you need to prepare for comes from Daniel 10, and it's 1,335 days. Or maybe it's Daniel 12.
Now, what happens if somebody said, don't worry about that, go by faith? The Lord will supply.
Well, it's kind of risky, ain't it? Because if you relied on your faith and the Lord didn't supply you, what are you going to eat? And how many calories are in faith? I'm not here to promote religion one way or the other. You know, if you want to rely on God to feed you, then I ask this question. If you go to Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, his disciples walked up to him one day and they said, hey, tell us what's coming down the pipe. And he says, okay, pay attention and I'll tell you. So he gave them some warnings. He said there's going to be famines and wars and rumors of war. So I asked myself this question. If I came to you and I said, can you tell me what you see in the future, and you said, I see a gigantic thunderstorm with a tornado coming through the embassy suites before 9 o'clock tonight, which is going to destroy it and kill 75 people in the process. And I said, geez, I think I'll just stay here and rely on faith, because after all, God would probably protect me. Excuse me, when the roof comes off, I'm going to get wet like everybody else, ain't I? So it seems like to me that maybe I ought to go out and get in my motorhome and drive 75 miles down the road over here where I can keep dry and get out of the road. My common sense just tells me to do that. Well, now, all I've covered here so far is the food problem, but you know you've got a disease problem, and we talked about this a little earlier. How many of you have got vaccinations? You all understand that you've impaired your immune system, haven't you? So if you've impaired your immune system and you're exposed to a disease pathogen, then aren't you likely then to die from some form of disease? Is there a way or a methodology whereby we could reverse out these vaccinations? Is there something that we could be doing? Could we change our lifestyle? Could we change our diet? Could we add something to that which might give us a better shot at survival, as opposed to doing nothing? Now, I suppose, you know, you could sit back and you could do absolutely nothing, and maybe you could survive accidentally. You know, people do that. There was a case on the Titanic. Remember the second officer, Light Lawler? See, he was up on the bridge. As the bridge went underwater, he was swept off, and he was pinned against this giant 6-foot grate, which was the air intake to one of the engine rooms. And the water was pouring in, and he said to himself, I guess this is where I'm going to die, because he was pinned down by the water flowing in, and he couldn't move. But the water flowing in, when it hit the boiler, caused an explosion. And it blew the grate with Light Lawler on it about 75 feet clear of the ship. At the same time, the last dinghy, which had been jammed in the davits, right behind the bridge that they'd worked for an hour trying to get loose and they couldn't, it blew it loose also, and he swam 25 feet over to it and climbed up on top of it. He died in 1964 at age 86. Want to give caprice a chance? Hell, man, I don't want to gamble that I'm going to be blown in a freak explosion, clear of the wreckage, and there'll just happen to be a lifeboat there for me to climb into.
How would you avoid raids? If you're storing all this stuff and somebody finds out about it, well, what I'm beginning to see, if everybody started doing that, somebody, you know, we go in and raid your place. How would you avoid
Yeah, you come on down and raid, but your problem is that you can't get it all, because I didn't put it all in the same pile. Okay. So what you do is you divide it up into 10 catches, and then you stash the 10 catches in 10 locations, so that if they build a freeway through there, they only get one or two of them, they don't get them all. I mean, just like you would if you had your economic portfolio, you don't put all of your eggs into stocks, do you? Or all into gold, don't you divide it up? Now, I don't have time to go through all of them. I just wanted to bring to your attention here this afternoon, and I got 5 minutes left before we quit, and that there are some survival problems. It isn't just money. When an economic collapse occurs, a lot of people are going to make a lot of money in the Great Depression of the 1990s. A lot of people made a lot of money in the Depression of the 1930s. Some people will suffer, some people will get rich, some people will get by and it won't be much of a problem, maybe a little nuisance. Some people are going to go hungry, some people aren't. Some people are going to have land, some people aren't. But let me tell you from my observations and from my interviews. There's an old biblical proverb that says, "Go to the hoary head and learn wisdom." So I look around the world, I look around the room, and I see one over here. And that's not meant to be derogatory. There's one over there. You're going to find that the fellow who's 50, 60, 70, or 80 years old has been around long enough that he's had some experiences. Now, when you're 19 years old, you have eternal life. I know, I was 19 once. And I used to fly airplanes, under power lines and under bridges, until I was 30. And when you get to be 30, that's when you come into what's called good sense. And then you finally understand that the family that flies together dies together. Then you fly over the bridges and over the power lines, and you know that you don't have eternal life until you get to be 40. And then you know that you've got 30 years left. And then you stop flying in your own self-interest. Well, same thing's true here. If I want to know what's been going on in times past, it's pretty late now because the 1930s and the people who lived through it are pretty much dead. I mean the old-timers, the people who were adults, you know. Well, I went to my Aunt Bessie and I said, "Aunt Bessie, tell me, what were you doing in 1925, 30, 35, and 40? And she says, "Sit down, Sonny, and let me tell you the answer." Well, in 1930, they moved to the Mattole Valley on the northern California coast, and they had a farm down there. They stayed there until 1941, when the war broke out, and then they moved to Fortuna. In that 11 years that they were there, they lived through the entire Depression. And she said, there was a shortage of money, but there was no shortage of food, and everybody got along quite nicely by using barter. We traded with the neighbors, and the neighbors traded with us. One guy would be a mechanic, and he would work. And the craziest thing I ever heard of, they had an oil well down there in Petrolia. I don't know if you ever heard of this. They drilled it in 1880, and there was a little bit of crude oil come out of the ground. And so some of those crafty farmers were taking the crude oil that came out of the ground, they refined it themselves and burned it in their Model T Fords through the 1930s. Where there's a little ingenuity and a will, there's a way. Now, they didn't have money for new cars, and they didn't take trips to Hawaii, but everybody made it quite nicely. So then I said, well, let's take a look and see what happened in the cities. So I interviewed some people who had lived in the cities, and boy, let me tell you, it was a bad place. Because when you didn't have a job, you couldn't pay the rent, even though it was only $5 a month. And you didn't have money for food, so the only alternative was to go down and sign up for the CCC camps or for some other form of government welfare or aid. And they lived from hand to mouth and lost everything that they had. Lost their houses, lost their cars, lost their jobs. Now, they all survived, but they didn't live very well. So I said to myself, when we go into the Depression of the 1990s, where do I want to be living? In the Bronx or in the Ozarks? And that's why I'm in Isabella, Missouri. I used to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, but it's not a good place for survival. Now, when you're talking about supply, and you say, or somebody say, I'm a Mormon, what does that tell you when you're hungry? That's the guy to kill. Did you hear me tell you I was a Mormon? Far be it from me. Now, but what there is now is a survival program or a methodology that we've developed in which I have analyzed the 64 life-threatening problems. So you might want to write these in your notes, and I'll tell you where the sources come from, and you can go home and you can check them out for yourself. Count them up. 64. They come from Leviticus 26. That's LEV 26. Deuteronomy 28. Matthew 24. Mark 13. Luke 21. Revelation 2, 3, 6, 17, and 18. And there's 64. Economic collapse is going to be a very serious threat to your life, but it's not the only one. AIDS is going to be a serious threat to your life, but it's not the only one. Famine will be a serious threat to your life, but it's not the only one. And when you add them up, there's 64. You got 64 problems. Every one of them has to have a logical and a systematic solution. And I've applied a logical and systematic solution, and it's a 5-day course. Now, how to make $100,000 on 25 acres or less, and how to barter and exchange are 2 classes that we teach to show you how to weather the economic adversity. Let me tell you that in the 1930s, people were reduced to barter. And I'm sitting here as a trade broker asking you, why would you want to be reduced to barter? It's the most profitable business venture that you'll ever get involved in. For the first time, you're going to get paid for what you do. You know, if you come and work for me, I'll pay you gold, wheat, corn, silver, beans. I'll give you something. You go out here and work for General Electric, they give you nothing. What they give you is a liability, and they'll take 20 or 25% of the liability and tax it away from you. Now tell me you want to go work for General Electric. But you know, that's the way the society is set up. Nobody wants to be paid, they want to be stolen from. Now, if you want to learn how to drop out of the system, this isn't for everybody. This is not a program for the masses of people out on the street. My God, what would they do for a living tomorrow? You know, the average guy is only concerned about television and beer. If he's got beer and a football game to watch, he's as happy as a clam at high tide. He's not concerned about a $30 trillion debt in the United States, or a balance of payments deficit, or a national budget deficit. He doesn't care about that. Let the politicians worry. Well, listen, when you've got an embargo, or you've got war, or you've got AIDS, herpes, and VD, or if you've got some other disease like cancer or rheumatism, you know, those are real concerns to people that think about them. I guess maybe I'm a worrywart, but I've been concerned about cancer for a long time. You know, I don't smoke. When you see a man that smokes cigarettes, there's a fellow that has no concern whatsoever about cancer. He's not bothered. Now, we don't know how long he's going to live. You know, John Wayne lived to be 72. He lived his full 70, smoking a pack of Camels every day. My grandmother smoked Camels until she died at age 89. I got concerned about it and stopped when I was 23. So I'm a guy that's concerned about cancer. I'm concerned about AIDS. Now, I'm not saying I'm not going to die from cancer, but I'm not going to die from cancer induced by smoking cigarettes. It might be from something else, but I'm going to eliminate that hazard. Now, I might starve to death, but it's not going to be because I didn't prepare. I mean, I've prepared. There may come a time when I run out of seed, but it's not because I didn't prepare plenty of seed in advance. So I'm not a prophet. I can't tell you that I've got the world by the tail and to follow me, and I've solved every problem in the world, because that's far from accurate. But I knew that there was a seed problem, and I've taken steps to alleviate that problem as it relates to me. Now, lady, I don't know what you're going to do, but let me tell you what's going to happen. if you come to me in 1998 and you tell me I'm starving to death and I don't have any food, I'm going to look at you and say, well, what's the problem? What are you looking at me for? And when you say, feed me, I'm going to say, terrific. What have you got to trade? And when you say, I don't have anything to trade, just feed me, I'm going to say, what the hell for? Do you people in here think I can support, feed, and take care of and solve every problem from every one of you people in here by myself? No. Even if I could, I wouldn't. And that's just the way life is. First of all, I'm not a socialist. It ought to be sufficient that I told you that there's a problem. My God, the Creator Himself told you in Matthew 24, there's a problem. You better get busy and solve it. What the hell more do you want me to do? I just told you, I think He meant what He said, and so I went out and solved the problem. I've stockpiled some seed, I stockpiled some food. I moved out of the busy metropolitan areas. I'm in a low-density location. And I'm working on the cancer problem and the AIDS problem and all 64 problems, and I'm working on them all at the same time. And I suggest you do the same.
What about water and air?
Yeah, I live in one of the 5 areas left in the United States that has clean water and clean air.
It's subject to change.
Exactly. I can't predict what the hell the government's going to do next week. No, over here they put a nuclear... They got a bomb base over here, what is it? And they're flushing all that trash down in your groundwater. Is that what I'm reading all over? And now you can't get any groundwater out of this Denver area? Hell, man. What's that tell you about this region? Doesn't it tell you you got dirty water? Doesn't it tell you you need to leave? There's 5 left. Talked to a guy from Canada yesterday. I said, Canada's a hell of a great place. God, I love it in Canada. One of the greatest places on earth. If it wasn't so cold and didn't snow, and if it would grow anything up there, it'd be a hell of a place to survive. I asked the fellow, I said, what are you going to eat up there in January? He said, yeah, that's a real problem. I said, well, I guess it tells you what your chances of survival are in Manitoba. Or Alberta. I guess this guy was from Alberta. Yeah, I went to Canada one time. I bought a place up at Vanderhoof, and I applied the survival technology and techniques of the 60s to that problem, and they fell right on their face. Let me tell you that the amount of calories that you can eat in a day and then go out and apply to the land, and the product that you're going to get out of the land is less than what you consume. I didn't think I could make it in what they called the banana belt of British Columbia in 1964. So at that time I decided I'd come back to the States. Okay, there's our program. That's what we teach. It's kind of wild and off the wall. It has to do with law. It has to do with survival in the plain, how do you live and how do you survive out on Main Street in 1990. And if you're interested in any of those programs or any of those schools, remember our name. It's George Gordon School of Common Law. And we're located at Post Office Box 297 in Isabella, Missouri, 65676. And our phone number is area code 417. Telephone number is 273-4967. Give us a call. If you haven't filled out one of our blue cards or you don't have one of our schedules, ask me for it and I'll give it to you. If you're interested in our newsletter, we publish a newsletter on a bi-monthly basis in which we talk about topics just like this. It's not a newsletter per se, it's rather a legal newsletter in which I talk about legal questions and legal topics. Well, it's been good talking to you this week. It's been a pleasure being here in Denver, and I hope to be back again. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. All right, now if you got any questions, we'll sit here and shoot the breeze for a while we...
How about the Social Security system
What do you got, babe? Did all you people pay me?
Yeah.
Okay, if you all paid me, then you're excused. If you didn't pay me, pay my wife. Man, how do you drop out of Social Security discreetly? And that's a good point, because if you leave the income tax system in a logical, systematic way, nobody's going to miss you when you leave. And that's the way I left. I don't receive any letters from the IRS. Nobody gives me any static. The rescission is a legal process, and it takes some education and training to do it, because you can only Do it once. Don't screw it up. Once you learn how to do it, you need to avoid the doctrine of latches, so that when you do it, you can't come back and say you failed in your mission. A rescission is a document that you're going to write up and send to Social Security and the income tax people for the purposes of notifying them that you're going to cease and desist from performance on the contract. It's a simple legal process. There's no big mystery to it. You can learn about rescission of contract from Bovier's Law Dictionary. Rescission is a legal methodology when there is no statutory remedy. We teach that in the tax class, business and professions class, in the basic school. Okay. Well, we're all through and we're about ready to leave anyways. Any other questions?
How soon do you think it would be before it would be possible, or will be possible to implement the program? Because I live near San Francisco, and I went to farm in the Midwest, and we got my seat together, and
3 years.
so you got my 3 years to be.
Plan on 3 years. That's about what I took. But you could do this if you put your mind to it in something less than 3 years, but we don't know how much you have in the way of resources. We don't know how much you have for living. There's a lot of questions that we don't know about. But in my case, from the time I closed the Atlantis company until I extricated my system, it was 81 to 84. 3 years.
Do you have 3 years to do that now, or
Say that again?
how soon do we actually have 3 years in time before we start feeling over the fall heavy?
Oh, do you have 3 years left? Oh, geez, I don't know. You know, God never said a word to me. Man, I don't know. All I see is what I see in the affidavit. Now, the affidavit would indicate to me that there's probably 10 or 20 years, you know, before the world collapses upon itself. But hell, you know what's going on here in the Middle East could terminate this thing in the next 5, 6, 8 years. I mean, we're getting into some heavy stuff over here. I don't think this is the big move. I don't think this is the Armageddon battle over here. I think that's going to be a big Oriental army that comes into the Middle East. But hell, they're going to be fighting over oil when they do that. I think there's probably some years left. I don't think that we're at the end yet. It's there's a fellow named Revy Batra who wrote a book called The Great Depression of 1990. You got to read that book. If you haven't seen it yet, it's still on the newsstands in paperback. It's $5. Well worth reading. The guy's from India, and he just took a look at the history of these depressions as they come along, and they seem to follow cycles. I don't know why. It appears that the 1990s is probably the decade for the next Great Depression. If I'm going to bet, I'm going to bet on the 1990s. And it's already upon us. We're already in recession. This oil thing over here has just triggered it. Business is in decline. But listen, recession doesn't mean that I'm not going to eat. Recession means that there's a lot of people out of work, business is declining, but hell, I may live better in the 1990s than I lived in the 1960s.
You mentioned vaccinations and rejuvenation of the immune system. What do you do specifically?
Diet. I use diet.
Diet or the lifestyle?
Yeah, lifestyle change. Stop smoking. Stop smoking. Stop eating unclean food. Start eating organic produce, organic foods. Work on building your body through vitamins and minerals. And I think you've got the best shot that you have available. That fellow right there, Mike, you're into body rejuvenation, etc. That fellow, Mike Rice, right there. Why don't you talk to him? He can tell you a little something about that. He's a naturopath. Those are the kind of people that I've talked to over the years, and many naturopaths will tell you, yeah, it doesn't make much difference what you've done to your body. One old-timey guy in his 80s told me, one old naturopath, he said, if your liver's still functioning at 15%, I can do wonders with you. When it gets below 15%, you can just kiss off and die. So it's hard, you know, you can have cancer, arthritis, rheumatism, all kinds of diseases, and you can reverse them out and treat them. All right, I guess I got to move out.
One more question, George. You were reading all about royal Dutch shell.
Yeah.
Where can I get a copy of that?
Okay, this is called the Seed Savers Exchange. Why don't you write to me at my school? Tell me you want a copy of these. I think they're $18 or $20 each.
You were reading
There's two of these that go together. Seed Savers Exchange gives you quite a little story, and then the garden seed inventory tells you of the companies and the individuals that are still producing the open pollinated variety. So I would get a copy of each of these. It costs you about $40.
You were reading about Royal Dutch Shop.
It's a Seed Savers Exchange. Well, this is a hell of a story. These guys are, research seeds. I mean, they just tell you, oh, sorry. I didn't even know there was a problem. I've been in agriculture all my life. I don't think the average farmer on this thing knows. When this thing comes down, it'll come down overnight, and all of a sudden they'll say, well, I'll just go to the store and buy seeds, and you'll go buy them, and you'll plant them and save your seeds, and the next year you'll start.
Right there. That's right here. And